Hi everyone, it's Jason Barger here, and we're together for another Entheos Academy whiteboard session. Today we're talking about how to practice servant leadership and to be changing our approach to almost every interaction that we have in life. Let me start out by saying that when we're talking about servant leadership, I believe that the world is in great need of servant leadership and servant leaders. And whether you think about your own family, you think about the special relationships in your life, when you think about your work, your community, or just our world, I believe that we need to be practicing servant leadership and be bringing a spirit of servant leadership into the world. The reason why this is called how to practice servant leadership is because none of us are perfect. None of us have this figured out. But I believe it starts with an intention and an awareness of what do we even mean when we talk about leadership, and what is it that we want to bring to life in the world? What approach do we want to have with the people and the work and the relationships and the priorities that are most significant to us? So we're talking about practicing servant leadership today, and in my opinion it begins with us reframing and repositioning how we even think about the word leadership. If you're anything like me, then you know that as you grew up and as you started to move forward in your career, you realize that maybe the word leadership has been hijacked in some ways over the years, that there's all kinds of definitions, there's all kinds of people out there, and in fact the word leadership has gotten so big and so broad that oftentimes we can fumble our way through it and not really even sure what leadership fully means. And so I had this drawn up on the whiteboard today because the traditional model of leadership is really about, the way you listen to the way people talk about leadership is that the traditional model is that the leader is on top of the pyramid, right? The leader gets to be at the very top and is the person that has the fancy title, the fancy car, the person that gets to just kind of bark out orders and tell everybody else what to do. And then everybody else, the job is to just kind of fall in place, right? Well, as we begin to talk about practicing servant leadership, in my opinion, the very first part of this, as we talk about the big ideas of today's class, is to begin to flip that pyramid and to flip it upside down in our own mind and in our own heart, and to be thinking about maybe the way we begin to approach leadership is not from this model of getting to the top, but really about turning that pyramid upside down so that in our own mind and in our own heart, that we actually begin to see ourselves at the bottom of the pyramid. And that practicing servant leadership is really about seeing ourselves in our mind and our heart at the bottom of the pyramid, and then turning to the people that we're lucky to be with every single day in our family, in our workplace, in our community, in the world, and saying, how is it that I can serve you? How do I begin to switch that frame of mind to say, if I can serve you and your needs and help put you in a better position for you to be successful, then how does that serve the mission of whatever it is we're trying to accomplish together? So we're talking today about practicing this, of flipping this mental pyramid upside down and really approaching every relationship and interaction in our life from the bottom of the pyramid. And so I want you to pause just for a second before I tell you a quick story. I want you to pause for a second and I want you to think about, who is someone in your life, a relationship, maybe a family member, or maybe somebody at work, it may be a member of your team or your entire business or company. And I want you to have them in your mind as we move through today of how you're going to approach that interaction and that relationship by flipping that pyramid and seeing yourself at the bottom of the pyramid. So pause for just a second and picture that person in your life. All right, so if you've got somebody in your mind, let's continue to dive a little deeper about this idea of servant leadership. And I want to start out by telling you a story. About last fall, I was in Malaysia, of all places, to give a couple of speeches. I was there for a little over 2 weeks, and while I was in Malaysia, I was staying at this huge hotel in Kuala Lumpur. Huge hotel. Every single day, the same thing happened. I came down from my hotel room. I came down. As soon as the elevator would open, my foot would hit this lobby. And this lobby, again, huge hotel, huge high ceilings, people everywhere, bustling around, you know. And there were about 40 bellhops that were rushing around and helping people with their bags, you know, helping them get from wherever they needed to go. And the same experience happened every single day that I was there. And again, I was there a little over 2 weeks. But as soon as my foot would hit the lobby floor, from all the way across this crowded lobby, here would come this bellhop named Servino. And Servino, he had this funny little trot, but he would come like trotting through, weaving his way through this crowd. And every single day, about halfway, you know, through the crowd, when he would get close to me, I would hear him start calling out as he's doing this funny little trot. And I'd hear him calling out. He'd say, "Mr. Jason, Mr. Jason." And then he'd come right up to me, and he'd stop, and he'd look at me, and he'd say, "Mr. Jason, how may I serve you today?" And I would look at him, and I would say, "Hey, Servino, you're great. Thank you, buddy. You know, we did this yesterday. All is good." You know, and he would look at me, and he'd say, "But how may I make your experience here better?" And I would look at him and say, "Servino, again, I'm good. We're all good. 5 stars. Where's the comment card? I'll fill it out. You're going to get a perfect evaluation. You're doing great." And he would look at me and he'd say, "But how may I serve you today?" And so we went through this routine literally every day that I was there for a little over 2 weeks, until finally there was one day where I come down and he does his little trot and he comes, "Mr. Jason," and comes running over to me. And he stops and he goes through his little song and dance of how may I serve you, how may I make your experience here better. And so finally I said, "Actually, Servino, today, you know, I'm a pale white bald dude in Malaysia and I'm going to be outside all day. I need some sunscreen or else you know, my head is going to get crushed." I was like, "Where do I get sunscreen?" And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, Mr. Jason, it'd be my pleasure. Follow me." And then he did this thing where he kind of turned to his side and he did this little like ushering thing where he started ushering me through the lobby. And we walked all the way through the lobby. And then we got out and the doors opened and we started going out to where the taxis were. And then we kept walking and he kept just kind of ushering me along. And when we kept going and then we kept going until finally we got all the way out to the street. And then it clicked into me, oh, Servino is about to literally walk me down the street to a store to help me find sunscreen. And so finally I stopped him and I said, "Servino, no, we're good. Just point me in the right direction. I'll get there." And his response back to me was, "But how may I serve you now? How can I make your experience now better?" The reason I'm telling you about Servino as we talk about this idea of practicing servant leadership is because he was one of 40 bellhops at this hotel, and I was there a little over 2 weeks, and I can't tell you anything about any of the rest of them. I know they helped me with my bags. I know they helped do some stuff. I know they were certainly busy doing their jobs, but I can't tell you one thing about them, and yet every single day in our interaction, Servino created a relationship with me. He did some very specific things that went out of his way to be the very best of practicing this kind of servant leadership and being the best ambassador of what this hotel wanted. And so I want to begin to think about what were some of those things that he did, or as we begin to think about these big ideas of practicing servant leadership, what were some of those things that he did or that we could begin to do with that person that I asked you to picture at the beginning of this class. The first thing he did was go to them. You know, he went out of his way to come all the way across the lobby to come to me to serve. When we think about the people in our own lives, do we go out of our way to go serve? There were plenty of other bellhops that were probably closer in proximity to me that he could have just waited and said, "Oh, they'll get them." But instead, he went out of his way to come to me before I even needed anything, or before I knew I needed anything. So I wonder, maybe the first part of practicing this servant leadership after we flip the pyramid in our own mind and our own heart is to think about how do we proactively go to the people that we are trying to serve in our relationships, in our marriages, in our family, with our friends, with the people on our team and the people that we work with? What does it mean for me to go down the hall and knock on the door and say, how can I serve today? How can I make your experience here better? The other thing he did very simply was, and I'm reminded of this, but the power of our names, a very simple thing, but the fact that he went out of his way to learn my name, to call me by name, and every day to say, Mr. Jason, how can I serve you today? How can I make your experience here better? Every time that we use someone's name and the power of their name, that it values them and it honors them in a very simple but profound way. The other thing, what does it mean for us to give them our eyes? Now, what I mean by that is not only literally just look them in the eyes, but in a very distracted and cluttered world. If you've watched maybe one of my other Entheos classes about my new book, which is called Remember, we talked about this idea that where you look is where you go. Whatever gets your eyes, gets your focus, your attention, that is where we tend to steer ourselves, and that's what gets our focus and our attention in a heavily distracted world right now. So we can't forget to the people that we're trying to serve, to make sure that we give them our eyes, we give them our full attention and our full focus. Once we go to them to serve, once we remember to use the power of names and to give them our eyes and give them our focus and our attention, then what would it mean for me to assume positive intent in that person? To assume positive intent. Again, not perfectly, none of us are, but for every interaction that I go to, I wonder how it would reframe and change the nature of our relationship if when I showed up to that relationship, I assumed positive intent in that other person. I assumed the very best in that person. I assumed that person on my team or my workplace or my wife, my kids, my friends, if I went to them and I could flip that pyramid, and when I get there, if I could assume that they want the best, if I could assume that they are trying their best, if I could assume that they want to do a good job, rather than, unfortunately, which is becoming an epidemic in teams and organizations around the world, is showing up to that relationship and already assuming that the person's going to drop the ball, assuming that they're a slacker, assuming they don't want the best. And yet, what would that do to the nature of the relationship if I could first assume positive intent in that person? And how would that impact the rest of our conversation together? Then I wonder what it means for me to listen. Part of practicing servant leadership is remembering that we need to listen first. That, the old saying that we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. But yet, so in a very busy and distracted world, so often we are quick to want to jump in and share our own thoughts, that we don't take the time to really honor and value another person by first starting by listening. And that sometimes practicing servant leadership is really just being able to be available and listen to somebody that is on our path. And the amazing, profound power that comes with just being able to listen to somebody that's needing to be heard. That's one of the ways that we practice servant leadership. The other way that comes to life when we have practiced listening with somebody is to show up with the mentality of seeking to understand before our need to be understood. That's one of the ways that this idea of listening comes to life as we practice servant leadership, is to make sure that when we go to that relationship, when we sit down with that special person in our life, when we run into somebody at the grocery store, when we have to have that courageous conversation with somebody in the workplace, that's a serious situation that we need to have resolution for, to first start out by sitting down and first trying to seek to understand rather than the need to be understood. That again, what would that do to the nature of the relationship if my first mindset was to sit with them and seek to understand their perspective? Hey, from your vantage point, how did that meeting go? Why did you make the decision that you did? Tell me how you kind of got there and why you made that decision. before me just opening up my mouth and coming into that relationship with a need to just be understood, which unfortunately in the world of leadership today, oftentimes leaders make up their mind before they even go into the room. And if they're operating out of this model of leadership, that oftentimes the way that it shows up is to come into the room and then to just say, hey, I'm here to tell you everything you did wrong, and let me tell you how we're going to correct this, and I'm the one that's going to bark out the orders and tell you what to do. That oftentimes that is the traditional way that leadership is played out. I was working with a company just recently where we were doing a leadership simulation where they had 20 of their emerging senior leaders in this company, a huge Fortune 500 company, and where they're putting them through a few-day intense exercises and role-playing of situations that do come up in the workplace, and as they evolve into leadership, situations that they were going to need to be ready for. And so each person one at a time would be given a scenario, of what the situation was, and then they would come into a room and they would need to respond with, how they would as a leader. And so the scenario in particular that they were given is that there was an employee who had made a decision that had lost the company a lot of money and seemed like it was a bad decision. And so the leader is given the scenario before they walk into the room, and then is supposed to come over and have this conversation with their employee. And so they come into the room, and there's a few of us that have been selected to sit as kind of a panel in the back of the room and to watch this role playing and this interaction of how they handle this situation, and then to watch, do the core values of their company and the kind of leadership that they're trying to define and trying to live, do those attributes actually play out in the way that they handle the situation? And so we watched 20 leaders come into the room, and out of the 20 leaders, how many would you guess came into that room knowing the situation, at least how they've been briefed, but came into the situation and took the approach first to seek to understand rather than the need to be understood? Out of 20, how many would you guess? Think about that in your head. When I ask groups, oftentimes people say, 50%, 10 out of the 20. Some people say, no, 5. Well, the reality is, out of the 20, 0. Not one of the leaders in the simulation that we did, not one of the 20 leaders came into the room with the approach of, I'm going to seek to understand before my need to be understood. Every single one of them came into the room with their mind already made up what went wrong and what had to happen next. And they sat down with the employee, instead of seeking to understand their perspective. Hey, why did you make this decision? Hey, tell me about what your thinking was. Tell me about what was at play with your team as you were working on this project. Not one of them took that approach. All of them sat down and said, we got a problem here. Half of them fired the employee on the spot. Part of the exercise was for them to realize, and the opportunity that was lost was that the reality of this scenario is that it was a short-term loss for the company. The decision that the employee had made was a short-term loss, but it actually was a long-term gain. And that the employee and their team had actually made a strategic decision, and there was a reason why they made the decision with this client, and they realized it was a short-term loss, but they were willing to do it because they knew it was betterment of the company. And yet the leader didn't even let them get to that point to explain why they made the decision, because they had already made their mind up. They were operating out of this model. They came into the room and they made their decision. The other thing that they bypassed in that rush to just be understood rather than to understand was that they didn't realize that this employee had also just received news recently that a family member of theirs had cancer. And part of this scenario, which the employee, the role-playing of this, that this is what had been going on beneath the surface in this person's life. And every single leader came into the room and didn't even honor them as a human being and even take the time to say, hey, how are you doing? How'd you make this decision? Is everything all right with you? And to build that kind of relationship. So a servant leader is going to be somebody that's able to flip that pyramid and to do some of those little things that we talked about in some of the big ideas to begin. But then when they enter the room, is going to seek to understand before the need to be understood. Another characteristic and a big idea of servant leadership is this idea of empathy. You know, we could spend an entire time talking about what empathy is, but a servant leader, when they're practicing empathy, is to really try to put themselves in the shoes of the other person. And to, before they jump to conclusions with that relationship, to be able to try to empathize what must that person be thinking or experiencing, and try to honor that and allow yourself a moment to sit in that space and say, hey, this must be a difficult decision for you, and be able to empathize with wherever they may be, even if it's different from where you are on your own journey. And so to empathize with that other person. Another characteristic of practicing servant leadership and really bringing this to life, this flipping of the pyramid so that it's not just a nice diagram on the wall, but is actually lived out in practice, is that a servant leader is somebody who's committed to the growth of other people. Just in their inherent DNA and the way that they operate every day as a leader is that they show people with their actions that I'm committed to your growth, not just my own growth, but I'm committed to your growth. And so again, if my mindset and my heart is to enter each relationship with how can I serve you better? How can I make your experience here better? They realize that if they enter each relationship and each team member with the spirit of a servant leader, they know that that committing to the growth of the people around them will actually, in the long term, it will make you better at whatever it is you're trying to do. It will strengthen your team. In many cases, it will increase the bottom line. And so it's a commitment to the growth of other people that begins to also build the culture within your team. And lastly, a servant leader leads with action. You'll hear me in a number of my classes that the way that I end almost every class is to be able to say, I want to encourage you to have a bias toward action. I love that phrase, to have a bias toward action. And if you know me, you also know that, let me make the distinction that I don't mean a bias toward busyness. Not a busyness running around just frantically doing things, but actually intentional, purposeful action that is bringing your mission to life. So to have a bias toward action, a servant leader is going to be somebody who's able to step back and then say, what are the 1, 2, or 3 actionable things that now I'm going to put into motion that's going to bring all of this to life today? What is it for that person that you pictured earlier on in this class? Whether it's somebody you're in a relationship with, a family member, a friend, whether it's that coworker or that team or your entire company that you or team that you manage, whatever that is for you, what are going to be the 1, 2, or 3 actionable items that you're going to put into motion to again practice this kind of servant leadership? Some of them very small adjustments probably to the way that you move throughout the world, and other ones might be a reframing and a flipping of the entire pyramid of the way you think about the way you move throughout the world. I want to thank you so much for being a part of this class and how to practice servant leadership. Again, none of us are perfect. All of us are practicing this, but it starts with changing our approach for every interaction that we have. And I hope that you'll stay in touch. I hope if you enjoyed this interactive class, I hope you'll check out some of the other classes that we have at Entheos. And certainly, if you're interested in more in this kind of step-back leadership spirit, I hope you'll check out stepbackleadership.com, stepbackfromthebaggageclaim.com, or bookremember.com, and stay engaged in this kind of leadership in the world. Thank you for who you are and the impact that you make every single day on the people that you lead and serve around you. Have a great day.